I will go ahead and get your attention and call us to order as last folks are starting to get a seat. To welcome you to this edition of the Sunday Seminar, America at 250. Ron and Jesse and I are grateful for your interest in this and your regular engagement. Grateful to our volunteers who have welcomed you at the desk. We really don't try to pry into your private life. We just like to know if you're here and what your email address is so that we can contact you with any announcements that we have. So if you have not resisted that previously, but we don't have your email address, feel free to go and add that on your way out. Vicki has also set up refreshments for us in the courtyard afterwards, so feel free to linger for a little while and to continue the conversation after that. Our subject today is going to be slavery and the reaction, the impact of the institution of slavery on this conversation about all men being created equal. I'll introduce Jesse in just a moment, but let's open with prayer. Lord, how we thank you for the gift it is to have an institution such as the church and this place in which to gather and these fellow citizens with whom to gather, whereby we try to remember where we come from and imagine where we're going and seek to be faithful to you, to keep our baptismal vows and to keep the vows we make to be faithful citizens. So pour out your Spirit upon the church gathered here that we would be led in our thinking and refined in our thinking, that we might live faithfully in the way of Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. If you don't know Jessie George Nickel already, she's a fellow church member of yours. The greatest thing about Jessie to me is that she's a fellow North Carolinian by birth. Her parents were faculty members at the University of North Carolina, Tar Heels. She's a Carolina fan. We share a favorite barbecue restaurant in Durham, North Carolina. But more importantly than that, the things that I have in common with her, Jessie graduated from Princeton University, which some of you may have heard of, where she also played on the soccer team and was the goalie on the soccer team at Princeton. And you still coach a little soccer these days, right? A private tutoring or something?
Just my daughter's
Just
team.
Your daughters, okay. So she went on to get her PhD at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's University, so there's a little bit of a tradition there, and currently teaches at Pasadena City College, and her next assignment coming up in the fall is going to be at Cal State Northridge. She is kind of a hidden treasure here at Community Church that you may not realize we have in our midst, and she's been, like Ron, so generous with her time and her willingness to share of her research and her knowledge with the group. And so she is married to Daniel. They have two kids, Annabelle and Evangeline. And if you came to the Christmas Eve service, the children's Christmas Eve service, Annabelle was the one who was in the lectern with all the kind of energy and imagination and enthusiasm you can imagine. She just knocked it out of the park. So I'm thinking that your house is a lively, active place on a regular basis. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jessie George Nickel.
Thank you for having me. Ooh, mic is on. And thank you for coming, even though Ron is not up here lecturing today. I really appreciate your indulgence. So I'll try to live up to his standard here. But I am going to talk about slavery and religion and the founding. And I'll start with this week, a feud erupted between the Trump administration and the Pope, you may have seen. And in the course of this back and forth between Trump and Catholic Vice President J.D. Vance on the one hand and Pope Leo on the other, Vance counseled that it would be best for the Vatican to stick to matters of morality. We're here to talk about faith and the American founding, in part because we know that separating politics and morality and religion is not possible. It's a core principle of our American government that there is no official established religion, but religion has always played an important part in American politics. We, as a country, with our diverse religious and moral values, can no more separate that aspect of ourselves from our politics than any individual one of us can. And in American history, this complicated relationship between religion and politics has been a force for both good and ill. Today, I want to talk about the relationship between politics, religion, and slavery from the founding through the start of the Civil War. And all of these things come together in this sentence that we've been meditating upon in this series, the part of the Declaration of Independence that Walter Isaacson, whose book Stuart had us read for last time, for those of you who did your homework, he called this the greatest sentence ever written. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson centered this idea that all men are born free, equally free and independent at the heart of America's Declaration of Independence. But we know that Thomas Jefferson also enslaved other people, enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his lifetime. This wasn't an incidental part of his life. His entire life and livelihood were built upon the backs of enslaved people. For us, and for some of Jefferson's contemporaries, this juxtaposition was and is galling. But we tend to interpret the ideas of the Declaration in a much more comprehensive, inclusive way than the founders did. When they said that all men were created equal, the founders, even those like John Adams who opposed slavery, did not imagine that they were talking about women or Black people or Native Americans. The kind of equality they were concerned about, the kind bestowed by God and justifying Americans' ability to rule themselves, that was equality among white men. And many of the founders would have restricted that category even further to white Protestant men of English descent. This was not a declaration of universal equality. And that was by design. At the time of the United States founding, it was the only large republic in the world. And the founders were greatly preoccupied with the fact that every other republic in history had failed. They looked at Rome and they worried at what they saw as the moral decay that had corrupted and destroyed it. They knew that a republic could only survive if its citizens were virtuous, that a government of the people was only as good as the people who ruled it. And so, one of the central questions they wrestled with was who should count as the people? Who could shoulder the responsibility of self-government and ensure that their government, unlike that of every republic before it, would survive? Now, no democracy in the world enfranchises all of its people. There's no such thing as universal political equality. We, for example, agree that children are not responsible enough to participate in the government that rules over them. And this same justification has been used throughout American history to deny political power to women, Black people, Native Americans, Chinese Americans, and many other groups. The founders of our country believed that denying political rights to those people was essential to their republic's survival and to the preservation of its social order. They feared that if democracy extended too far, that it would descend into chaos and anarchy. So, hierarchy, just as much as equality, was a core tenet of the American founding. And some Southerners, in particular, saw slavery as an extension of other forms of social hierarchy. These Southerners saw no tension between the idea that all men were created equal and their enslavement of other human beings. In fact, their determination to preserve slavery was the most important reason that many of them supported the revolution and the fight for American independence. Now, the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775. That's a year before the United States declared independence. And at that time, the war was basically a rebellion against Great Britain. It was a protest against British policies, and Americans in that war were lobbying for what they saw as their rights as equal British citizens. But that same year, the Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation saying that any enslaved person who joined the British Army to fight against the Americans would gain his freedom. And eventually, 20,000 enslaved people took him up on that offer and joined the British Army. And this policy helped to solidify Southern support for the Revolution and for American independence when it was declared the next year, in which Americans declared that all men were created equal. But Southerners' relationship to the Declaration changed over time. Even though they saw no conflict between the idea that all men were created equal and the fact that they enslaved people, plenty of other people did. Once America issued its Declaration of Independence, the principles it proclaimed no longer belonged to the people who had written and adopted them. It didn't matter that Thomas Jefferson didn't mean to include Black people or women in his contention that all men were created equal, because different groups of Americans seized those ideas for themselves. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John at the Continental Congress demanding that he and his fellows, quote, remember the ladies when forming their new government. Or the women of the United States, and this is a quote, would foment a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. John just laughed in response, and he said he refused to give over, in his words, to the despotism of the petticoat. Abigail did not get what she wished, but there was a more successful movement among opponents of slavery led by Black people and enslaved people themselves. They petitioned state legislatures all over the country to recognize the incompatibility of fighting a war for freedom and equality and enslaving other people within their society. A Boston man named Prince Hall appealed to the Massachusetts legislature in 1777, remarking his astonishment that it has never been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of her unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of ending slavery. Arguments like this helped to convince the state legislatures in all of the northern states to abolish slavery during or shortly after the Revolution. And the anti-slavery movement would continue to wield the Declaration of Independence as one of its most powerful weapons into the 19th century. This movement ramped up starting in the 1830s with the rise of immediatism. That's an anti-slavery movement in which people contended that slavery was a great moral wrong and should thus be abolished immediately, thus immediatism. And as this anti-slavery movement gained new momentum, so too did abolitionist demands that Americans reckon with the contradictions between their founding principles and the continued existence of slavery. Black abolitionist David Walker wrote in his highly influential appeal to the colored citizens of the world, practically screaming from the page, "See your Declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? Hear your language, proclaimed to the world. July 4th, 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident that," and this is in all caps, just like on the internet, "all men are created equal. That they are among these, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Compare your own language, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders inflicted by your cruel and unmerciful fathers and yourselves on our fathers and on us." This pamphlet was considered so dangerous that its publication and dissemination were outlawed in the southern states, and the state of Georgia placed a $10,000 bounty, equivalent to about $350,000 today, on Walker's head. Southerners grew increasingly alarmed as the anti-slavery movement expanded in the 1830s and in the following decades. And as they did so, they also became increasingly wary of the Declaration of Independence and its pronouncements about equality. Some Southerners would move to reject the Declaration altogether, seeing these ideas as dangerous fodder for political radicals. But I'll return to this in a minute. In response to immediatists' attack on slavery as a great moral wrong, Southerners also began to defend slavery in a new way. Now, traditionally, slavery's defenders, including people like Thomas Jefferson, characterized it as a necessary evil. They acknowledged on some level that it was wrong, but abolition was simply too dangerous to be attempted, as they saw it. Starting in the 1830s, though, Southerners increasingly defended slavery as a moral good. And the leaders of this campaign were Southern ministers. Most of the anti-slavery kind of written arguments were written by ministers. They were at the forefront of this movement. These ministers relied heavily on the Bible to make their case. They highlighted that slavery appears repeatedly in the Bible and is never explicitly condemned. Instead, slaves are instructed to obey their masters as they would Christ. But they didn't restrict themselves to arguing that there was some sort of tacit or silent acknowledgement of slavery in the Bible. They argued that the Bible lifted up slavery as an essential feature of Christian society. The Bible's entreaties that slaves obey their master appear alongside other similar entreaties, that wives submit to their husbands and children obey their parents. This is how Southerners defended slavery as an extension of the hierarchical familial system in which father and master lorded over those under his care, in the same way that God ruled over and protected his people. Northern ministers were also at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement, and they countered this narrative with their own vigorous arguments against slavery. They emphasized human equality before God. They emphasized that God had made man in his image, and the attempt to turn a person into property, to dehumanize him, was an attempt to unmake what God had made. They didn't reject all hierarchy in society, but they argued for the centrality of basic human dignity to Christian doctrine. Northern ministers, in other words, argued that slavery ran counter to the most central fundamental principles of Christianity, as they understood it. This warfare between Northern and Southern ministers over the righteousness of slavery eventually produced a split in various Christian denominations. Both the Methodist and Baptist churches split into Northern and Southern branches in the 1840s. There was also a schism in the Presbyterian Church in 1837, driven by both theological disputes and slavery, dividing the church into mostly Northern New School and mostly Southern Old School wings. These splits would offer an ominous preview of the divisions that would split the country a few decades later. But more than that, these divisions in these churches contributed to the alienation between Northerners and Southerners before the Civil War. So, too, would Americans' escalating fight over the nation's founding and its relationship to slavery. With the rise of the anti-slavery Republican Party in the 1850s, arguments that the Declaration of Independence was an anti-slavery document moved into the mainstream, led, as Ron will talk about next time, by Abraham Lincoln. At the same time, it became more commonplace for Southerners to openly reject the Declaration of Independence and its ideas. Pro-slavery theorist George Fitzhugh put it this way: "It is, we believe, conceded on all hands that men are not born physically, morally, or intellectually equal. Their natural inequalities beget inequalities of rights. The weak in mind or body require guidance, support, and protection. They must obey and work for those who protect and guide them." These arguments echoed the religious arguments that pro- and anti-slavery ministers made on both sides of the slavery debate, with opponents of slavery emphasizing equal human dignity and proponents of slavery emphasizing the importance of hierarchy. The Civil War would split many Americans on these same philosophical and theological questions because, for many of them, as for many of us now, there could be no easy division between their holy and their profane lives. There was no easy way to separate their religious and moral selves from their political identities. Now, there are a few aspects of these debates that I want to highlight for you as we begin to return to the question of religion and politics in modern society. The first is that the importance of religion to these debates made them worse, exacerbated tensions over the slavery issue. Injecting religion into them raised the stakes of these debates and helped to further alienate Americans from one another. We would do well to remember that religion can just as easily divide as unite us. But we also have to face the inescapable fact that these debates were about slavery. And I think we can all agree with Abraham Lincoln's assessment that if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. I don't think it's controversial to say that time has revealed the opponents of slavery and not its defenders to be the righteous ones. Certainly, their ideas more closely match our modern views about right and wrong and equal human dignity and equality before God. We can understand why they felt it impossible to separate those beliefs from their political actions, even if those actions contributed to a conflict that eventually ended in civil war. But we also have to contend with the fact that their opponents, those who defended slavery as a good moral thing, felt that same sense of righteousness. They believed just as ferociously that they were right, and they were willing to destroy the country and fight a long, grueling, and devastating civil war to prove that. Both sides in the Civil War, those fighting to preserve the Union and eventually to destroy slavery on the one hand, and those fighting to destroy the Union and preserve slavery on the other, both believed that God was on their side. Just as Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has called on Americans to pray for American military victory in the Middle East, so too did the leaders of the United States and the Confederacy call on their citizens to pray for military victory in this war. It is a lesson for us as we try to navigate our own ideas about politics and morality and religion. It's a reminder that we should do all these things with humility. And so I'm going to leave you with a quote from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural. I'm going to end here in the place that Ron will pick up next time. In that speech, after 4 years of grinding war, after the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans on both sides, more than had died in all other American wars put together, Lincoln reflected on both the causes and the costs of war. He remained convinced that they were fighting a just war, but he acknowledged that no man, including himself, could claim the judgments of God as his own. This is what he said. Both sides in this war read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to the man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern herein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be repaid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Thank you.
Ron and Jesse can go ahead and take their seats on the stage. Randy Stewart is going to be our mic hopper today to take your questions. We hope that today's conversation will be also a segue into next month. The goal all along was that this was going to be more than lectures, but it was going to be conversation among folks who seek to be responsible citizens. And we really want that to be the case today with your questions, not only to the experts here on the stage, but also even interacting with one another. We will set up the room differently in May so that it's not all like this, but we'll actually have tables set up and we'll have an opportunity with some prompted questions so that you can be discussing the issues involved. And so, Ron, do you have any comments you'd like to make before we proceed on to the questions?
Well, let me join with all of you in saying how deeply, deeply grateful we are for Jesse's presentation. Absolutely marvelous. One clarification, she uses this wonderful word, immediatism. It's important to know how Christian faith was very much at the heart of the anti-slavery movement. Where did that word immediatism come from? It came from the whole understanding of conversion. If one is converted immediately, then slavery could be abolished immediately. The thinking of the time was that slavery might be abolished over time. Even Southerners at one point admitted that. But then the cotton gin came in and the defense from the Bible came in. So this was part of what it was. What I think you're lifting up, Jesse, and will continue to do so going forward, is the Declaration of Independence a living document? Is it a living document? Let me just read what Abraham Lincoln said when he came back into the political fray in 1854. He had served 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature, 1 term in the United States Congress. He called the war with Mexico absolutely immoral. The Mexicans did not start this war. The Americans started this war. He went home to Springfield and his constituents said, "Thank you very much. We'll never elect you again." So he became a full-time lawyer for 5 years, but then he came back into the fray, and as he often did, he used language from the Bible. He used the metaphor from the book of Revelation of how the blood of the martyrs would then be exchanged for white robes. And this is what he said. Our Republican robe is, by Republican, he did not mean Republican Party, he meant the nation. Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us re-purify it. And then he saw often these words, let us readopt the Declaration of Independence and with its practices and policies which harmonize with it. So what Jesse has been talking about and what we're talking about is the Declaration of Independence is not simply one historical document in 1776, but it actually had lost its relevance. Lincoln suggests that we need to readopt it. So I love the way that you've talked about the various understandings of it. I love the way you brought in David Walker and said, don't you remember the words of the Declaration of Independence? Just a marvelous presentation for us to think then today, how might we readopt the Declaration of Independence?
Questions? I see Morty at the back there. Okay.
The most important sentence ever written be interpreted so ambiguously? Aren't we after something that's concrete?
Is that for me?
I think you should let Jesse be the main person who answers questions.
Well, it's an excellent question, but you know, as I've got my headset. Thank you, though. The question was, how can the most important sentence ever written be interpreted so ambiguously? And you know, the point of my talk here is that the Declaration of Independence, just like the Bible, has been interpreted by different people at different times, including our own, in lots of different ways. That doesn't mean that they're equally right, and they don't necessarily gel with our own understanding of these things. But I think it's important to remember, when we fight about what the Declaration of Independence means or the Bible means or whatever, that, for example, our understanding is very different from the founders. And that means we should have some humility in how we talk about it and fight with other people about it, given the long history of people understanding it differently, and we would probably say getting it wrong.
It probably goes along with what Ron says about the Declaration of Independence being living.
Ron, you may be able to speak to this you've published a lot of books. One thing I've learned as a preacher is that I never know what the sermon's going to be until it's a sermon. It's a creative act to write a sermon. Like it's a creative act to write a lecture or to write a book. And Ann had a boss at Vanderbilt who said, you may think you know what you know, but until you write it down and share it with people, you don't know what you know. And I would add, I think the word is living and active. And preachers don't even know exactly what they're saying, even as they're saying it. And what I'm trying to acknowledge is there's something mysterious about truth, that we are all seeking truth. We're all aiming to grasp truth and convey truth, but none of us owns the truth. And sometimes we end up getting owned by our own words. And I don't know if you have any.
Well, presently I'm writing a biography of John Quincy Adams, and his great mentor, who he so enjoyed, was Chief Justice John Marshall, who was the longest serving Chief Justice in American history. And I was quite interested to find that in John Marshall's later part of his life, after John Quincy Adams had given a remarkable address on the Declaration of Independence, this is what John Marshall said. He said, the Declaration of Independence should mean different things at different times. Different things at different times. I'm not really ensconced with this originalist idea of many of our Supreme Court justices, that we simply go back and say, well, what did it mean in 1788? Or what did it mean in 1810? Chief Justice John Marshall, I'll side with him. It should mean different things at different times. So when Lincoln says readopt, he thinks this is a reforming document that needs to be understood now in 1854 differently than Thomas Jefferson understood it when he wrote it in 1776.
Thanks. I have several questions, but I'm not going to take up everybody's time. I'm fascinated by the whole subject. Anyway, so first question is, when the quote that you gave of Lincoln about slavery, I understood that Lincoln's reason for the Union, fighting, well, they had to fight the war, but that it was about states' rights, and he didn't really talk about slavery until Sumner kind of kept getting on his case. And a couple years later, he finally talked about slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation. Is that true? And just curious what your...
So should I take this one? Sure. So everyone understood that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. The Southern states seceded from the Union after Lincoln's election, after a Democratic election, because they believed that a Republican president, a president at the head of a party committed to ending slavery eventually, was too dangerous to be born. That is why the Southern states seceded from the Union. The states' rights they were talking about were the states' rights to protect slavery. They did not hide that. There was no ambiguity about that. They sent emissaries to the states that had not seceded yet and said, it's too dangerous to be in a union under a Republican president. You have to secede to protect slavery. There was no ambiguity about that. That said, when the Civil War started, the United States was fighting to restore the Union, to bring the seceded states back into the fold. They were not fighting to end slavery when the war began. And if the war had ended before the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863, the Union would have been restored with slavery intact. Lincoln acknowledged that. He said repeatedly that, I would restore the Union and free all of the slaves. I would restore the Union and free some of the slaves. I would restore the Union and free none of the slaves. I am fighting a war to save the Union. But by 1866, to 1863, when he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and the final Emancipation Proclamation, the United States embraced ending slavery as a war aim, in part because they believed that they could not safely restore the Union with slavery intact, right? Slavery was the reason that the war had happened. It was the reason the southern states had seceded. They had been fighting 2 years of a really costly, bloody war, and they were worried that if the war ended with slavery, they'd have to do this all over again. There was also, after years of war, a growing appetite to punish the South for what they had done, and that was part of it too. But also, that was a very controversial war measure in 1863. Desertions went way up. George McClellan ran against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, hoping to, this was the Democratic presidential candidate running against Lincoln. In the election of 1864, there was a presidential election in the middle of the Civil War. And George McClellan didn't support emancipation as a war aim. He wanted to end the war, probably not with uniting the Union. Or he said that they would try to negotiate a reunion, but he wanted to stop the war, which basically would have ended the war with the country divided and slavery still intact. And that was one of the closest times that, the war came to ending with the Confederacy victorious, as if George McClellan had won the election of 1864, which is a very long-winded answer, but to say that slavery was always the cause of the war, but slavery as an aim of ending the war is something that only came later in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. But Lincoln always cared about it, but he cared very much about the Constitution, and he didn't believe he had a constitutional right to end slavery within the United States. Eventually, he embraced it as a war measure, as something the United States could do to try to end the war and make sure that peace would be meaningful. So.
And real quick,
Yeah.
but wasn't Sumner a real influence on Lincoln and his thoughts about slavery after a couple years of the Civil War, or not? That's what I've understood.
So, yeah, Charles Sumner was a radical Republican, sort of the, kind of more radical wing of Lincoln's party. And that wing of the party pushed Lincoln to make ending slavery a war aim from the very beginning, as did all sorts of abolitionists believe that, this is a way that we can accomplish this, and we should. But Lincoln took years to embrace that idea. And he did get pressure from that wing of his party and other opponents of slavery, but he held off for quite a while. And as I say, if the war had ended before January 1st, 1863, the Union would have been restored with slavery intact, and Lincoln was willing to accept that up to that point. So.
Well, I bet you a lot of people don't know that. And and I'll give up the microphone, I promise. Stuart knows me. I could go on all day, but I won't. I was also a goalie, by the way. No.
Nice.
But the other thing was, do you think, I didn't know about the 20,000 slaves that became soldiers for the Union. I didn't even know that our army was even that big. So I'm kind of surprised that.
In the Revolutionary War, you mean? Yes, so 20,000 enslaved people joined the British Army during the Revolutionary War.
That's a lot of soldiers at that time,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Well, and in fact, the United States, the Continental Army, when it was founded, George Washington would not allow black men to join the army when the war started. But after Lord Dunmore's proclamation, when the British started recruiting enslaved people to join his army, after that, Washington allowed black men to join the Continental Army. So there were black men who fought for the United States, but more fought for the British, as you can imagine.
Which gets me to my last question. So how about if the Brits had won the war and we're now sitting here praying or
British citizens?
honoring the Queen?
Andy would be thrilled.
Yeah, Andy. But seriously, would they have done away with slavery had the Brits won the war, in your opinion?
Well, the British abolished slavery before the United States did. First in Great Britain and then in its colonies in the 1820s. Is that right? So yes, presumably slavery would have been abolished earlier. By the time the United States abolished slavery, it had been abolished in most of the world. Slavery was very much on its way out. Brazil was the only other large country that kept slavery afterward. It was abolished in 1871, I believe, in Brazil. But I will say that when the Civil War started, slavery was very much going strong in the United States, right? That's what the war was about. It was not fading or likely to go away without the Civil War. No.
Suppose you can come to the conclusion that the Equal Protection Clause, all people are created equal, applies to all people regardless of the color of their skin, their religion, or maybe even their sect. You know, you're part of that minority in society. And it's 1860 or it's 170 years later, and the majority or a near majority of the people that you're around think you're wrong for one reason or another. How do the three of you experts, if you're even willing to do it, try to show them there might be a benefit to loving one another?
That's an interesting. So if we were talking to people in 1860, is that what's the case? Or today? Oh, to get. Well, good question. Ron, do you want to go first on that one?
Well, Jesse began by talking about the recent conflict between Donald Trump and the Pope and J.D. Vance. Well, there was an earlier one before Pope Leo became the Pope. And this was the conversation that J.D. Vance had with the then Secretary of State of the Vatican. And he was arguing using the Catholic concept of what's called Ordo Amoris, the order of love or the order of charity, to justify the Trump administration's policy. And so J.D. Vance claimed that under this principle, we should love our own family first, the fellow citizens of our own nation second, and lastly, people around the world. And the Secretary of State, knowing that this concept had been formed by Augustine and then lifted up by in the Middle Ages, said, I think you've got this wrong. No. That's not what Ordo Amoris means at all. It means that we are to love everyone, and we do not make, Jesse lifted up this concept of hierarchy. We do not have a hierarchical view today to say that family, nation, and yes, migrants are in that order. The Secretary of State of the Vatican said, Ordo Amoris does not mean that. It means that we are to love everyone. The very same concept that really was central to Martin Luther King Jr., that every single individual created by God is of value. So I think this is something that we do need to say today in our very much divided nation.
You know, Fred, one word I'd like to add to that is a subject that needs to get lifted up, and it came to me when Jesse was talking. The rationalizations made by Southern ministers about hierarchy, about the lack of equality. Natural theology started rearing its ugly head in the church in the 19th century. And it's something that Scottish common sense philosophy started to have an impact on Presbyterian theologians in the New World. And it continues to be a struggle for the church. What are our sources of authority? And what do we ascribe to God versus what we ascribe to our own ways of thinking? And it was a natural theology that justified people treating black people as less than human, looking on the outside, ascribing to them because of the shape of their head or their nose. I don't know if you've been to the museum in Montgomery, Alabama, the Civil Rights Museum in Montgomery and the Lynching Museum. You cannot go there and not weep for the inhumanity that was rationalized and justified theologically, but according to a natural theology, not a theology grounded in the scriptures and in the church's historic faith about who God is and who human beings are made in the image of God. So you will hear from me time and time again this summons to think about who are your sources of authority and with whom are you thinking as you are rationalizing the kinds of treatment you are subjecting other folks to.
This is a question for Dr. White. Since you brought up the living constitution, that it's a breeding, my question is about this whole concept of giving citizenship to people that are born here, whether that is before the Supreme Court right now, whether you think that the law that was, the amendment was passed at that time should still apply at this time.
What's the next question? Well, birthright citizenship was one of the three amendments that grew out of the Civil War. It was a way of wanting to solidify the fact that African Americans, whatever their origin, whether they came from Africa, whether they had been in the country for generations, they deserve the same birthright citizenship. So now we're facing obviously a different situation, but I'm not sure we can go. John Roberts said, "Well, it's a new day, but it's the same Constitution." So it'd be fascinating to see the way the Supreme Court rules. It seems to me they're going to rule that birthright citizenship is the same, and we have to respect anyone who's born into this country has become a citizen. Obviously, it's a different circumstance than the 1860s, but is it the same Constitution? Yeah.
And I'd like to add, if I may, Phil, that one of the purposes of these gatherings is for us as citizens to embrace our heritage and be stewards of it. Clearly, the Constitution lives and breathes. Clearly, it demands interpretation by courts, and also it requires appropriation and living out by its citizens. And so regardless of one's stance on originalism versus living document, the rubber hits the road as the American people actually obey the law and enforce the law. And so in one sense, academic arguments are not helpful. Is it or is it not the case that there is such a thing as birthright citizenship? One of the other questions is, what kind of people do we want to be now? Who are we? And what kind of people do we want to be as American citizens?
Thank you very, very much. A question for Jesse. What are you hearing from your students about all of this today? That's something I'm afraid of. The economic drives of this nation have pretty much obliterated moral and social consciousness from the minds of a lot of our youth, I think. Where's the struggle at this point for them?
You mean, what are they worried about? And well, so, I mean, my students are 18 years old and, 20 years old, whatever. And 18 and 20-year-olds are knuckleheads to some extent. And my students are no exception. They're worried about, a lot in their own lives. But I know they worry about opportunity, certainly. A lot of the students I teach at Pasadena City College and Northridge are lower income students. Most of them are not white. A lot of them have come from difficult situations and have not been gifted with every opportunity in life and are trying to make something better of themselves. But it's hard. A lot of them are also juggling jobs and families and whatever. And I think as a result, often are, just focused on trying to survive, even if I hope they would deal with bigger questions often. But, for example, both of those institutions are predominantly Latinx serving institutions, and I have to have a talk about what happens if ICE shows up at our classroom door and what I have to do. I have students who are afraid to come to class because their parents are undocumented and don't feel comfortable with them leaving the house. Last semester, I had to cancel my final exam because of the ICE raids and protests in Los Angeles last spring. So that's certainly something that's very present for my students and is affecting them in ways that I can very much see, in addition to all the regular things that are affecting them. So.
My question is, and I preface this, I think most of the people, or perhaps all the people here, believe in the equality of races. My question has to do with, should racial integration be achieved naturally, what perhaps some would argue it is, or administratively or legally?
Oh, can I get this one? Thank you. I mean, God, I feel like this is above my pay grade. Does anybody else want to answer this
I'll
one?
start.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, Ron, I'm reading right now a book called Undelivered, which is speeches that didn't get delivered because circumstances didn't work out. So it has Eisenhower's drafted speech in case the D-Day invasion failed, that thank goodness he didn't have to offer. But one of them is from the mayor of Boston on the eve of schools being integrated and busing kids from the north end of Boston, switching with kids from the south end of Boston. And Boston had Irish in one neighborhood and they had blacks in another neighborhood. And it was, you know, very difficult time. Boston, probably the toughest place in the country. And I come from the South, right? And so this is personal history for me too. I think the answer to your question is yes. If in fact, you know, naturally, you know, it'd be great if racial integration had happened naturally. It would have been wonderful if within human hearts and human systems that racial integration happened naturally. But the system was set up to prevent that, frankly. There were redlining practices that literally prevented natural integration. In Nashville, Tennessee, a man in my church was a realtor. He lived in a neighborhood a few miles from the church. All the streets were named for Confederate generals. That he showed me the documentation from the 60s of redlining that prevented people from selling their houses to black people. And so it would be fabulous if by persuasion and by conversion of the heart that integration had happened. It didn't. In one sense, because conversion isn't mass like that. In another sense, it was the law that prevented it from happening. And so the pains that school systems went through in integrating schools by busing, Nashville, Tennessee has a bunch of private segregationist academies that were all founded in 1971 when busing came to Nashville. It was a tragic circumstance that was born out of human sin, and a combination of changed hearts and persuasion and legal coercion were required, and it's still not fixed yet. The public schools of Nashville still struggle. I sent my kids to a private school in Nashville because they weren't going to get they weren't going to get a decent education in the school we were zoned for. I think it's still unfinished work, frankly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the use on each side of the Bible and God says I'm right. Do you historian folks have tools that you use to try to evaluate the sincerity historically of either side saying that? And if so, could you describe them a touch?
Sure. I mean, there's lots of evidence that both sides believed very deeply in what they were arguing. I mean, Southerners were, the fact that the Civil War happened is great evidence of how deeply Southerners were invested in the institution of slavery. Rather than risk the future of slavery under a Republican president, they would destroy the country. They'd secede, they'd rip it apart and create their own nation and abandon all the heritage and history associated with that. The 4 years of grueling war, 800,000 Americans died, Reconstruction in which the South massacred black people and lynched them and did everything they could to try to reimpose slavery. Southerners were deeply, fundamentally committed to the institution of slavery. And we have every reason to believe the things that they said, which were, of course, self-serving, but they firmly believed that white supremacy was ordained by God and natural, and fought for many decades to protect that system. And, that has continued into the present. So in different iterations, of course. But, people on both sides were willing to die for these ideas. I think, they proved with their feet and their lives that they believed that slavery was right and ought to be protected. Even people who did not own slaves did that. Most soldiers who served in the Confederate Army did not own other people, but fought a war to protect the institution of slavery because they were deeply invested in it. So, yes, many lives and, much spilled ink proves to us that Southerners believed slavery was right. Either, kind of aggressively believing it was a great moral right, which some of them certainly did believe, but at least embracing that I believe that this institution is something to protect white supremacy along with the institution of slavery is something I'll fight and die for, is something that, was the entire purpose of the Confederacy and the Civil War.
I want to hear Ron's answer too. I want to share with you just one citation, a brief citation to illustrate what Jesse's talking about. This is from Charleston Union Presbytery in 1835. Resolved that in the opinion of this presbytery, the holding of slaves, so far from being a sin in the sight of God, is nowhere condemned in his holy word, that it is in accordance with the example or consistent with the precepts of patriarchs, prophets, and apostles, and that it is compatible with the most fraternal regard to the best good of those servants whom God may have committed to our charge, and that therefore they who assume the contrary position and lay it down as a fundamental principle in morals and religion that all slaveholding is wrong, proceed upon false principles.
Just in response to the question you're asking, how do we know the sincerity or how do we know their views? I worry about how we're going to write history of 2026. I'm now writing about John Quincy Adams. He kept a diary that had 16,000 pages. He put 600 words on every page. Congress met 9 to 12 hours a day. If you've ever been to Congress these days, you will see that no one's there. No one is there. Someone who talks to C-SPAN is only talking to a camera. They met 6 days a week. They met on Christmas Eve all day long. These were people, now we can read their letters, we can read their diaries, we can know what they really thought. And this allows us to get back into this time frame, the years before the Civil War and the Civil War. And if you would have used, quote unquote, a teleprompter, a woman who is a wife of a congressman said, if you would have stood up and read a manuscript, you would have been laughed out of Congress. You were expected to be able to speak an hour and a half or two extemporaneously because you knew what you were talking about. You hadn't been elected because you were a self-styled real estate developer who could fund his own campaign. These were people who really knew what they were doing, whether you agreed with their point of view both sides. It's quite impressive to see the way John Quincy Adams is 78 years of age and he's going to Congress 9 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. is really quite remarkable.
Up here, Todd.
I was told to stand up.
Thank you.
So I think it's great. Rightfully, we're being looking at our history critically and how we can do better. But what I always look is through history. Egypt has slaves. Humanity doesn't have a great track record. So 250 years, such a big country. I think we've done pretty good. Has other even we have these terrible things. I mean, what other countries or what other societies do you think have done it better than us and or are doing it great now? Even with all our sort of warts and scars, I still think we're maybe more equal than a lot of other places. Not that we should stop, but so I just historically or
How we doing?
yeah, go.
These are
go
you guys
America.
just keep throwing softballs at us. We really appreciate it. Well, I'll speak. I'm not sure I want to get into the country Olympics here, but I will say one thing about taking, all of your history into account. The United States is the oldest continuous republic on Earth, and that has meant that a lot of our our warts have existed in our republic, or some of the worst things in our history existed within our republic as opposed to in a monarchy, as it did in a lot of other countries. But
England.
one point of what we're talking about here is that the Declaration of when I teach the Revolution to my students, one thing we ask about was the Revolution revolutionary? Because it created a republic for property-owning white men, which is kind of what it had before, just with the king on top. But the most revolutionary part about the American Revolution is its ideas, and it sets the stage for everything that happens later, right? The progress, as we would think of it in American history, the more inclusive way that we read the Declaration of Independence to include women and people of all sorts of different races, that is progress that has been mediated through those ideas, right? Those ideas are important. It's not that we have rejected those ideas and embraced something different. We've used those ideas in new ways to embrace more people over time. So I think trying to ignore the terrible parts of our history, you wouldn't want to do that any more than you would want to ignore the worst parts of your own life, the worst decisions you ever made, the worst things you ever did, because those are the things you learned from and changed and, have made you what you are, that you've improved and become better. And I think thinking about our history this way is uplifting if you see it as potential, as opportunity, as all the things that came from the Declaration of Independence, even if it was originally meant to apply to white Protestant Englishmen, basically. That's not why the Declaration is important. The Declaration's, it's important because of everything it has become since then, or it's bigger than what it originally was. And I think that's worth remembering. I didn't really answer the question, though. Does somebody else want to answer the question?
Yeah, I'm not in a position to do the Nation Olympics myself either. Yeah.
I have one last question, if you don't mind. Going back before the Civil War, could you just briefly discuss Nat Turner's uprising and what that did to the Southern abolitionist movement? Because I understand there were abolitionists in the South, and then once Nat Turner's rebellion happened, that all dried up. So just curious.
Yes, so Nat Turner's rebellion, that was a slave rebellion in 1831 in Virginia, and it was a really interesting moment because after this rebellion, Virginia debated for the last time abolishing slavery of its own accord, basically. There were debates in the Virginia legislature about, is slavery too dangerous? This idea of, there have been slave uprisings throughout history, slowly get rid of it to try to remove this danger. Eventually, the Virginia legislature decided not to abolish slavery and became even more committed to slavery after this. So this is around the same time of what I was talking about, the rise of immediatism, this kind of like more aggressive anti-slavery movement arguing for the immediate abolition of slavery, and Southerners feared in part that enslaved people were being infected by these ideas, as if enslaved people, it did not occur to them that they might want to be free until white abolitionists told them that they might do that. But that is the story that slaveholders told themselves, because that was easier to believe than the fact that all the people whom they oppressed, who lived on their property in their homes, did not want to be enslaved. So there were moments in Southern history where Southern states did think seriously about abolishing slavery. Henry Clay famously tried to get Kentucky to abolish slavery in 1849 when it changed its constitution. But the South repeatedly turned away from that and became more and more committed to slavery. Even Southern states like Virginia and in the Upper South, where there were many fewer enslaved people than in the Deep South, for example, where cotton production was most profitable. So Nat Turner was an interesting moment in Southern history that kind of demonstrated the general trend that we saw, which is that, there were questions about whether or not the South should keep slavery, but the fundamental question debated in the Virginia legislature was not, is slavery wrong? The question was, is slavery too dangerous to maintain? Thomas Jefferson had that famous quote where he talked about this: we have the wolf by the ears and we can neither safely hold him nor let him go. That was his understanding of slavery, that this was a dangerous situation that we were in. It's built on enslaving people who don't want to be enslaved and who resisted their enslavement in many ways and, across time. And the slave revolt was just the kind of most nightmarish of those types of resistance. But yes, I feel like I strayed from the question again. Did anybody?
Yep, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up there, and we are going to hang out. There's refreshments out in the courtyard if you'd like to remain for a while and talk. Again, our thanks. We'll be back together on the 17th, and so, Ron, you want to give us a little preview of May the 17th? Or is it the 19th?
One of my surprises, and it might be surprising to you, is that in some ways the Declaration of Independence lost a lot of its currency in the years later, 1830s, 40s, 50s. People viewed it only as the document that had severed, in a good way, the relationship of the colonies from Great Britain. So that's when Lincoln decides he's going to readopt the Declaration of Independence. So what would it mean to readopt the Declaration of Independence in 1860? What would it mean to readopt the Declaration of Independence in 2026? For Lincoln, it was not simply, therefore, an historical document cementing the new relationship of the colonies to become the United States. It was a reforming document. So if it's a living document, what it might mean the next time we meet, what needs to be reformed? And is the Declaration of Independence still a living document, or is it simply an historical artifact? We'll talk about that next time.
Okay, who's got the date? May 17 or 19? 19, May 19. One last word of thanks to the two historians in the room, to Ron and Jesse. Please stand, let's pray. Lord, what a gift it is to be called to be among your people, and what a blessing it is to live in this particular blessed land of bounty and fruitfulness, of democratic governance, of an attempt to live well and to live generously and to live virtuously, and to be a place that is a place for dreamers, a place where there is an opportunity for us to grow in not only our love for you and our love for our neighbor, but also to grow and flourish through all the gifts that you have provided in this land. We pray for our nation. We pray that it would grow more fully into the will that you have for it and into the ideals that were expressed, and that we ourselves might contribute to that in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, y'all.